Joining me now is Phil Perry from Boston, Massachusetts, a writer and reporter for the Patriots for NBC Sports Boston. Phil, thanks so much for taking a couple minutes. I know you've been on the beat for a really long time now, and it's great to see you.
It's great to see you too, Carolyn. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Let's start with the hot topic in New England. Quarterbacks. We know that this is a quarterback-driven league, and there's been a lot of question marks around Cam Newton. I think everybody or most people are maybe in the camp of he's not going to be able to offer too much more this season than we saw last season. Granted, that was a pandemic-shortened year, not a lot of time to learn the playbook, all those sorts of things. But I think he fell short of that bargain expectation that was making a lot of fans excited before the season started. Is there a case to be made that Cam Newton will be better this season than he was last season?
I think there is. There's a pretty strong case to be made, honestly. Just when you look at, Carolyn, the additions they've made around the quarterback position this offseason, you add 2 high-priced tight ends, you add a couple of free agent receivers that the Patriots are really high on, and Nelson Aguilar and Kendrick Bourne. Right then and there, your roster offensively has improved leaps and bounds. And so even if Cam Newton has the same sort of physical skill set that we saw in 2020, which was not very good when it came to throwing the football in particular, the people around him are going to make him better. And so the numbers statistically are going to be better. I have no doubts about that. My question would be, as a guy who is into his 30s now, as a guy who has had a bad shoulder for multiple seasons, as a guy who had a foot injury that basically wiped out a year for him that he's still kind of coming back from, or was last year at least, is his body going to hold up and be effective enough that the Patriots can be real contenders? Because even if he's improved statistically, it doesn't necessarily mean they're all of a sudden going to be Super Bowl in that sort of running like there used to be in every single year. So I think he's going to be better. I don't know if in a vacuum his physical abilities are going to be so far and away improved that the Patriots are really going to be, A, competing for the AFC East, because I think the Bills are the easy favorites there, but B, competing for the conference, which, again, that's what they want to be doing. I just don't know if he's the quarterback to put them in that spot.
Because the nightmare scenario, Phil, would obviously be maybe they are a little bit more patient in the draft, or they don't make that big move to bring in a quarterback, and you put all these offensive pieces around a guy like Cam Newton to bolster the offense, and the red zone is improved and all these things in theory, but you're missing that key piece. You don't have the talent, the physicality, whatever that once existed to get it done, and they have another mediocre season. What do you see the Patriots doing as it relates to the upcoming draft? I know there's been a lot of talk about maybe trading up or getting the Falcons involved or targeting a quarterback. I mean, are they going to be patient like we've seen them be in the past?
I think they might be, but you hit the nail on the head, Carolyn. If you have a quarterback in the NFL who's just fine, which I think Cam Newton could be fine, but it's almost the worst place to be, because you're going to end up, they were 7-9 last year. Okay, 17 game schedule now. Maybe you're talking about 10 wins, but are you in the playoffs? And then if you are, congratulations, are you winning a game in the playoffs? If you're not, you're still too good to be drafting anywhere near the top 10 to get your next superstar quarterback of the future, conceivably. So it's a really tough sort of tightrope that they're walking right now, where they might just be okay. And you really don't want to be okay in the NFL if you're building towards that next great team. So for me, given where they're drafting right now, they're 15. They don't want to be drafting higher than 15 again anytime soon. This is also looking like a really deep quarterback class, where the consensus is we're going to have 5 quarterbacks taken in the first round. Maybe a 6th even sneaks into the very bottom of the first round. You combine those two factors, where the Patriots don't want to be picking any higher than this, and there's probably not going to be another quarterback class like this for another couple years. You put those two things together, and to me, it makes a lot of sense for them to give away a little bit in terms of draft capital, try to move up, and get a quarterback that you think has some promise, and just throw that dart. And if you miss, you miss. And maybe you end up as a not so great team in the NFL, but you're in the running again to get your quarterback maybe next year. I just think you have to try at that position to get a superstar, because if you're just okay there, you're really not going to be competing for what you want to be competing for.
I know there was some injury speculation, Phil, or some documented injury related to Jarrett Stidham heading into the start of last season. And then, of course, everything was shortened with the pandemic. You don't have a real training camp. Everybody's scrambling to learn the playbook. Ultimately, the Patriots decided to make the move and go with Cam Newton over him. Is there any reason to think that Jarrett Stidham still has the potential to be the Patriots quarterback of the future, or unfortunately has that ship really sailed?
It's going to be hard for him. I think he's going to need a lot of luck for that to be able to fall into place the way that he wants it to, because at this point, if you're the Patriots, you have essentially two backup quarterbacks. I think they told us a lot about how they feel about Cam Newton, quite frankly, given that they gave him a 1-year contract that's worth basically a base value of $5 million. That's a backup quarterback. If they thought he was the guy and he was the guy of their future, they would lock him up to a starting caliber kind of contract. Jarrett Stidham, meanwhile, not only was he just the backup to Cam Newton last year, but really coming out of camp, Carolyn, he was the third guy. He was behind Cam Newton and Brian Hoyer. And so they did not like what they saw from him. He did deal with some injury, but they didn't love what they saw from him last summer. And now for him to get a real opportunity, especially if they add another quarterback, and there have been some talks of them potentially adding 2 more. So you could have Cam Newton, another veteran, Teddy Bridgewater, for instance, is available right now, and maybe they draft a quarterback in this upcoming draft. Now you've got 4 guys in that quarterback room. It's going to be really hard to challenge for reps, and Jarrett Stidham might be the 4th out of those 4 if that's what ends up happening. So I don't even know if he's going to have the practice time available to him to be able to win the job. I just think that's where he is right now. I don't think he's off the team. He's cheap. He's young. He does have some physical talents that the Patriots liked when they drafted him a couple years ago. But I would say he is a legitimate long shot to ever be the Patriots starting quarterback.
Interesting. You mentioned Teddy Bridgewater. In your evaluation, do you think that he would offer more to the Patriots than, say, Cam Newton?
I do, just because I think he's a more talented thrower of the football at this point. And that speaks volumes of what Cam Newton put on tape last year, quite frankly, because Teddy Bridgewater doesn't exactly, have the golden arm back there behind center. He's a dink and dunk quarterback. He's one of the shortest throwers in the league and has been the last few years. When he's seen some time, he filled in for Drew Brees a little bit last year and performed well, but he's very conservative just by nature. Same thing this past season in Carolina, but he's accurate. He's smart. He typically takes care of the football. And so when we're talking about potential quarterbacks for 2021 here, the conversation always comes back to Jimmy Garoppolo for obvious reasons. But when you look at these 2 players side by side, Teddy Bridgewater's a little bit younger. Even though he almost lost his leg a few years ago because of an injury that he suffered in Minnesota, when he's been given the opportunity to play the last couple of years, at least he's been available, which Jimmy Garoppolo hasn't always been able to say. He's a little bit more accurate. He's a little less prone to throwing interceptions. So if you're looking at, he's going to cost less, by the way, in terms of his contract and in terms of what you'd have to give up in a trade. And so Teddy Bridgewater, to me, makes a lot of sense for them to try to bring on. If they don't want to shoot for the moon in the draft and trade multiple future picks to move up and get their quarterback of the future, okay, I get that. It costs a lot to try to do that. But Teddy Bridgewater seems like a great fit if you are trying to play the cost-effective game at that position.
Feels like something that the Patriots might do. I know that you have been studying the draft, studying positionally kind of what the Patriots need to continue to improve offensively, maybe between the trenches even, which I think, that's where you get a lot of bang for your buck, maybe with some of these other guys in the draft that aren't necessarily stars or skill position players. But if you're going to contend for a Super Bowl, you need to really be strong there at those positions. When you look at the draft positionally, it's obviously a quarterback-driven league, and you mentioned that there are a lot of really solid choices at the top of the draft. What other positions do you think there are a lot of value in right now in this particular draft class?
Yeah, it's a really deep draft at offensive tackle, which is a spot where, if we're talking about the Patriots, they could use a guy. They have 2 right now, Isaiah Wynn and Trent Brown, but both guys are on 1-year contracts essentially this year. Both have been off the field for health-related issues the last couple of years. So it's a really strong offensive tackle class where you have a couple of big names at the top, and Penei Sewell from Oregon and Rashawn Slater from Northwestern, but you're going to be able to find starters at that position well into the 2nd round and maybe even into the 3rd, Carolyn, which is rare. Usually these tackle prospects that have everything that you're looking for in terms of size and athleticism, those guys go off the board early because they're just rare humans. You don't find many guys built like that. But this year, for whatever reason, I would say there may be 10 or 12 of those types of players who could end up starting in the next year or two that are going to be available. So it's a great class there. It's a great receiver class again. This is the third year in a row. Now, next year is probably not going to be as strong, according to some of the scouts that I've talked to, but this is 3 years in a row now where the receiver class is absolutely loaded. So you're going to see Jamar Chase go off really early. You're going to see Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle from Alabama go off really early. But again, it's another position where in the second, third, even fourth round, you're going to be able to find guys that are going to end up starting for you that are really good athletes. Some of the testing numbers have been through the roof this pre-draft process. And a lot of that is maybe because it's all pro days now. There's no combine. And so the numbers are a little bit inflated. But the athleticism that you're seeing player for player at that position is just insane. And so that's another spot where every team probably feels like it could use some kind of pass catcher. And if you can wait until the third or fourth round, you're still going to be able to get a guy that you really like. Some of the positions that are tough, if you're in need, like I would say tight end, outside of Kyle Pitts, who looks like a phenomenal player, but he's going to go maybe in the top 5 out of Florida. He's a great player at tight end. There's maybe one defensive tackle prospect who's going to go in the first round, and Christian Barmore from Alabama. So those are the spots where if that's a need for you, it's going to be a tough year, because if you don't get one of those, or if you don't get that top guy, you might just be better off waiting until late on day 3 and just throwing darts at the board there and hoping you get an athlete who can play. But tackle, receiver, if that's what you need right now, you're in a good spot, because there are a ton of those types in this year's draft.
I know you've been, like you said, talking to a lot of scouts, just doing a lot of homework on this. And I've been so fascinated by the ultimate 30,000 foot view of how this pandemic has affected this draft class and some of the other players even who are not going to be drafted this year, but just the ripple effect of it all. When you talk to scouts, when you talk to those who are inside the league, what have they told you about players, maybe specifically for this draft class, their ability to adapt to the pressure of making that move from college to the pro game? In some programs like Alabama, it's basically NFL B. I mean, I think we saw that with the national championship, and those guys are super, super ready to make that adjustment. But for some of these other hidden gems that you mentioned later on down the draft board, what sorts of things do scouts, team personnel look at when they're trying to assess how is this player going to translate into a much bigger game?
It's really hard for them this year because of all of the COVID-related restrictions. And so the scouts that you talk to, a lot of these guys just plain and simple were not on the road at all. And so all of that digging that you do typically throughout the course of a college season and then into the off season before the draft, it's just, you can still do some of it. Of course, you can still make phone calls. You can still have virtual calls with people from the program, but it is just different. And so that's some of the feedback that you get, is that it's almost as if these information, the report cards that they're filling out on these guys, essentially, they're incomplete in some ways because the information coming in isn't to the same level. And so that's one concern that these guys have, is that you're not able to see them in person, and that's really what they love. Those of us that watch from afar and, can find a lot of these clips online, the tape is great, right? If you could just go off the tape, if you could evaluate everybody off the tape, that would be great. It's a total football person thing to say. But the scouts really want to be able to see these guys with their own 2 eyes in person. They want to be able to, in some cases, get their hands on these guys and shake them around. Like, I'll never forget Bill O'Brien telling me, after the Patriots back in 2010 drafted Rob Gronkowski, he was coming off a back injury who didn't really work out for teams, but he visited teams. And so he's in a shirt and tie at Gillette Stadium, and they bring him into a meeting room, and they didn't sit down, it sounds like, the entire meeting. They had Rob Gronkowski up, and he was working blocking drills inside the building in the meeting room because they just wanted to they knew how tall he was, they knew how much he weighed, but they couldn't get a sense of, okay, what's this guy's frame like? How does he feel when he's blocking you, when he's pushing on you, when he's leaning on you? What does that feel like? These are the scouting things that football people care about, and you haven't been able to do a lot of that stuff with these guys this year. So that, number one, is really difficult. But number two, some of the things that you can maybe put more emphasis on this year as opposed to others to try to help make up for that lack of information is you can rely on your relationships, which Bill Belichick does all the time. He's got his friends in the coaching ranks. We know who they are, whether it's Greg Schiano or Nick Saban. You can go on down the list. You can rely on those people. The other thing that was big this year was the Senior Bowl. The Senior Bowl, you finally get a chance, especially for some of these smaller school guys, to see them compete against top-end competition, but it also gave teams an opportunity to meet these guys face-to-face, to talk to them, to have a conversation about who they are or about football. It was just one of those rare chances because there's no combine this year. There's no pre-draft visits for teams this year. It was a rare instance where you could sit down face-to-face with a player and get to know him a little bit better. So I think the Senior Bowl, especially for some of those gems that you're talking about, Carolyn, like Dwayne Eskridge from Western Michigan, or there's a tackle whose name is Spencer Brown. Gosh, there's just so many names floating up in my brain right now, Carolyn, that I almost passed out right there on camera in front of you. But Spencer Brown from Northern Iowa is like a just massive tackle from Northern Iowa who's a great athlete who went to the Senior Bowl and played well, and he helped himself. If he hadn't had the Senior Bowl in a year like this, especially, he might have been a guy who fell deep into the draft, like late on day 3. But now you're talking about maybe like a second or third round guy.
So you think the Patriots will use this, Phil, to their advantage? I mean, I don't know why. Maybe I'm dating myself here, but I feel like Rutgers is always the school that comes to mind for me when you talk about them kind of parachuting in and picking out those gems that turn into be really valuable, players that can go the distance in the league. But all that to say, you think the Patriots are going to be able to maximize their value in the draft and find some of those guys that nobody's ever heard of and really mold them and shape them into having some significant value?
Well, we'll see. I mean, they haven't been able to do a good enough job of that these last few years, which is why this past offseason they go out and they spend the amount of money that they had to spend in free agency. If they had just drafted a little bit better, you don't see them shelling out the kind of cash that they had to shell out. But the team had gotten so bad because their drafts had been so bad that they had to pay their way out of the hole that they had dug for themselves, essentially. So we'll see. Again, they do have those relationships, which are great when they work out. Yeah, Devin McCourty, Daron Harmon, Logan Ryan, like when those guys come from the Greg Schiano program because they have that Schiano stamp of approval and they work out, that's great. Bill Belichick has also drafted guys from Alabama that didn't work out necessarily. Cyrus Jones, chief among them, was a second-round pick, and he dealt with some injury, but it doesn't always go well when you lean on those types of relationships. I think N'Keal Harry, who was drafted the first round 2019, is a pretty good example of that. He played for somebody named Todd Graham at Arizona State, who Bill Belichick has a lot of respect for, has a good relationship with. Todd Graham's stamp of approval didn't really matter because N'Keal Harry, it turns out, doesn't look like he can play at this level or at least be a fit in the Patriot system after a couple of years in the NFL. So those relationships can work for you. They can work against you at times too. I think in a year like this, you want to lean on those as much as you can, but the best idea might actually, Carolyn, be to just rely on what you see on the tape, because if they're, some of these players don't have as much as some others, but if you can glean from what you see on film that a player is going to be a fit for you, maybe that stamp of approval is nice to have at the end, but it shouldn't be where you start.
That's great stuff, Phil. Just one last thing, because I know you got to jump. The quarterback class in this year's draft, as advertised, in your opinion?
I think it's a really good quarterback class. Now, does that mean they'll all hit, Carolyn? I have no idea, but nobody does. And that's the beauty of the draft, is that all of these players are crapshoots to a certain extent. And the fact that we're talking about 5 quarterbacks in the top 10 picks potentially of this year's draft sounds crazy. But the value of hitting at that position is so massive. It's so significant to your chances of truly being able to compete that I think it's worth that kind of risk. If everybody is a risk, including the defensive tackles, including the offensive tackles, if you hit on an offensive tackle, that's awesome. It's a valuable position. But if you're a team like the New England Patriots and you're looking like you're a quarterback away from really being a good team, hitting on an offensive tackle doesn't carry nearly the same value as hitting on a quarterback would. So again, you want to make that gambling analogy. If they're all scratch tickets, the quarterback draft pick is that, $50 scratchy, and you may get nothing out of it, but you also have that potential for the, maybe $1 million payday. And if you want to go a little bit cheaper and you want to take a guard, if you're the Patriots at number 15 overall, you may end up winning a couple bucks on that scratch ticket, but it's just not going to take you to where you would love to go ideally. So to me, again, this quarterback class is going to be flawed. Mac Jones isn't the best athlete in the world, doesn't have the best arm in the world. Trey Lance is coming from FCS competition, didn't play football last year, has one season essentially under his belt. These are guys that may end up going in the top 10. I think they're worthy of being top 10 picks. I still have no idea if they're going to work out. But again, that's the beauty of the draft, and that's the beauty of that position. You see teams go absolutely bonkers trying to make sure that they're set at that spot, because that's just how important it is. Now, the Patriots may try to go another way and say, I'm Bill Belichick. I can still win games even if I don't have a great quarterback. And it would not shock me, Carolyn, if that's what ended up happening and the Patriots ended up taking Christian Barmore, defensive tackle from Alabama at 15.
I don't know how another mediocre season would register with the Boston fans that we know and love so much. Bill Perry, NBC Sports Boston, great insight on the upcoming draft. Thanks for being with us.
No problem, Carolyn. Thanks for having me.